I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the submarine I was on. Okay, it was stationed in Key West, Florida. It was an old Guppy II World War II converted submarine. Had new batteries put in it right after the war, and it was sent to the Panama Canal Zone for the first couple of years, and then it was decided to make it an operational submarine and send it to Key West, Florida, and join other submarines there, and that's where we were stationed. I was a part of 6 submarines that were in one division, and we had 9 officers on board and about 85 enlisted men. And we operated daily out of Key West, and we we went out and we played target for the ASW, the Anti-Submarine Warfare students that were in school there in Key West. It was a big school for sonarmen and guys that were standing watches in sonar looking for submarines. So we went out and played target. When the Cuban crisis developed, and that was in 1962, the submarines in Key West were directed to leave Key West and head north. And so all of us left the Key West about the same time. Before we left, we were directed to offload all but 3 of our war-shot torpedoes that we had on board, and exercise torpedoes. So we took all those torpedoes off. We were basically empty except for 3 war shots that we kept on board all the time. There were a couple of other submarines in my squadron that were also directed to offload their torpedoes, but not all of them like we were. So we sort of surmised then that we had been selected to do a special operation involving the Cuban crisis. So we headed north in a long line of submarines. There were about 9 or 10 of us that ended up leaving Key West on the same day. We weren't directly in a line like you think of a marching group, but we were in effect a line. If you looked at us from the sky, there was a bunch of submarines all headed in the same direction. We were headed around Miami and to points north. We were one of the latter submarines, and we were the first one to pull out of formation, and we pulled into West Palm Beach, Florida. And it's interesting why we would go there. It turns out that the Seaboard Railroad ran a railroad track from the Norfolk, Virginia area down to Miami. And there were very few ports along that route that had an east-west spur of railroad track. But West Palm Beach had a pier that had a railroad track on it, which meant that they could send a rail car down there. Hello.
Hi.
How you?
Great, how are you?
Good. Thank you for letting us use your space.
No problem at all.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So we pulled into West Palm Beach, and we noticed that the railroad spur was empty. So we said, well, wonder why in the world we pulled in here. Well, that night at midnight, the railroad engine delivered a car down that railroad spur and parked it right adjacent to where we were. And we were told to go over and open up the doors on that railroad car, and in there we would find some torpedoes, and we were to load those, but to do it during the night. We didn't want anybody that was in the public area there in West Palm Beach to know what we were doing. So we immediately rigged up to load torpedoes. We could load about 3 at a time. And so we loaded about maybe 4 or 5 torpedoes that first night, and then we shut down for the day. During the day, we became a public visiting submarine so that all the local people in West Palm Beach could come in and visit a U.S. submarine. But of course, we cordoned off the 2 torpedo rooms. There's a torpedo room forward that has 6 torpedo tubes in it. There's a torpedo room at the after end that has 4 torpedo tubes in it. And those were off limits. We put there's a porthole to look through when you shut the watertight door to give that compartment integrity. There was a little peephole to look through there, and you could see what was going on in the room. So we blocked those so nobody could look in and see. And we began taking these war-shot torpedoes and going through the process of making them ready to shoot. And so we did that for 3 nights. We loaded until we had about 15 to 18 torpedoes loaded between the 2 rooms. And each night we got the new ones that we had put on board ready to shoot. It turns out that what was happening up in the United Nations was that Khrushchev was banging his shoe on a table, and people saw that in the news at the time. And if you read a story about the lead up to the Cuban crisis, you'll probably read that about Khrushchev. You probably remember that.
I remember seeing that. Sure.
I remember it well. It was on the evening news for about a week of him banging his shoe on the table at the UN, complaining about the United States and what they were doing in regards to Cuba. The reason that it's called the Cuban crisis was that the Soviet Union had sent some missile firing units down to Havana. And they were waiting for some other components, including the missiles that they could fire, and they were only 90 miles from our shore in Key West. So we didn't want them putting any live missiles down there and missile launchers in Havana. And the United States had told the Soviet Union, don't you send any more of those components down there to Havana, because if you send missile components and we know that they go on board, we're going to sink the ship that has it, that is carrying them. And little did we know that we were one of those units that had been selected in the event that they crossed that imaginary line, that we would be the ones that would fire to sink the ship. Of course, that's all we learned later. In the meantime, once we got loaded out with our torpedoes, we were sent to go back out to sea, and we just sort of moved slowly down towards the Miami area, because the imaginary line went basically from Miami to the edge of Cuba, which is where we have our Navy base. And that was where the line was that this ship, if they had missile components, were not supposed to cross. And lo and behold, a ship came down, and the intelligence people identified the fact that they did have missile on board. And so we were sitting there at periscope depth, and we were watching that ship. And he was about 2 miles or so from that imaginary line, and all of a sudden he began to do a slow turn away. And he turned away from that line and went on out towards the west to get in deeper water. We were at alert. We had our submarine torpedoes loaded and ready to fire. We had our fire control teams on watch. We call that battle stations torpedo. And we were set and ready. If we were called on by the president to sink that ship, we were prepared to fire those torpedoes and sink the ship. And after the boat turned, or the ship turned, we realized that they had heeded the warning that they had received from the president and his group staff, and that they were not going to deliver those components to Cuba. So in effect, the crisis itself was over, but there were a lot of lingering aspects to it. One of which I need to go back. After the crisis sort of died off when the ship turned away, we were sent back up to Joslin, South Carolina, to offload those torpedoes that we had prepared.